It didn't start with screaming. It started with something much quieter, something so subtle that if you had asked me back then whether I felt unsafe, I would have said no without hesitation because there were no slammed doors, no public humiliation, no obvious betrayals, only a gradual shift in the atmosphere of my own mind that I mistook for normal relationship friction. When people hear the word toxic, they imagine chaos, but what I experienced felt structured, almost disciplined, and that is precisely why I stayed as long as I did. In the beginning, he felt attentive in a way that made me feel chosen, and as a woman who had once questioned her worth in quieter ways, being chosen felt intoxicating. He asked detailed questions about my day, remembered small preferences, noticed shifts in my mood before I articulated them, and I interpreted that awareness as emotional intelligence rather than early monitoring. I told myself that being deeply seen was a privilege, not realizing that the line between being seen and being managed can be dangerously thin. The first cracks appeared as small corrections. He would adjust my interpretations of events in ways that sounded rational, explaining why my reactions were slightly exaggerated, why my memory of a conversation wasn't fully accurate, why my emotional response didn't quite match the facts. He never raised his voice while doing this. In fact, his calmness made me doubt myself more efficiently than anger ever could. I began replaying conversations in my head, searching for the exact wording I had used, wondering if I had indeed misremembered. I told myself this was growth. I believed that perhaps I had been too reactive in past relationships, that this was an opportunity to become more measured, more logical, more mature. When he described me as sensitive, he did it with a soft smile, as if it were a charming flaw rather than a quiet indictment. I started filtering my emotions before expressing them, rehearsing my sentences internally to ensure they were reasonable enough to survive his scrutiny. Toxicity rarely announces itself. It erodes. What unsettled me most was not what he did, but what I slowly stopped doing. I stopped trusting my instincts when something felt off. I stopped sharing half-formed thoughts, afraid they would be dismantled. I stopped laughing as loudly. My personality did not disappear overnight. It recalibrated inch by inch to avoid friction. And because there was no overt cruelty, I felt almost dramatic for sensing discomfort. He never called me worthless. He simply made me question my worth in subtle, strategic ways that were difficult to name. There were moments when he would withdraw emotionally without explanation, becoming polite but distant, and when I asked if something was wrong, he would respond, "Nothing, you're imagining things," in a tone that suggested concern for my overactive mind rather than acknowledgement of his withdrawal. I began to feel embarrassed for asking. The next time distance appeared, I stayed quiet, convincing myself that mature women do not need constant reassurance. The silence became heavier than any argument could have been. I remember one evening vividly. We were sitting at dinner, the conversation light, almost pleasant, and yet I felt a tightness in my chest that I could not logically justify. From the outside, everything looked functional. We had shared routines, mutual friends, structured plans. But inside, I felt like I was walking on a psychological tightrope, constantly adjusting to maintain equilibrium. I told myself that all relationships require compromise, but compromise should not feel like erasure. Somewhere in the middle of that relationship, I began reading quietly about emotional dynamics, not because I believed I was in something harmful, but because I sensed confusion that I couldn't articulate. I remember reflecting on certain passages in an ebook about boundaries and self-awareness, recognizing patterns not in him alone, but in myself. My tendency to over-explain, to justify, to assume responsibility for emotional climates that were not entirely mine. That recognition did not make me leave. It simply planted a quiet seed of awareness. Awareness is destabilizing. For a while, things seemed to improve. He became more affectionate, more verbally reassuring, and I felt a wave of relief that almost brought me to tears because I interpreted the change as proof that my patience had paid off. I convinced myself that the tension had been a misunderstanding, that perhaps I had projected old fears onto a stable man. I relaxed. I allowed myself to believe we had crossed into healthier territory. I thought the storm had passed, that the truth about toxic relationships is that they do not always escalate. Sometimes they cycle. The warmth would return, then subtly retract. The affection would deepen, then thin out. The confusion would resurface just when I felt grounded again. Each time I blamed myself for not being consistent enough, not being secure enough, not being evolved enough to maintain the harmony I briefly tasted. The real shift happened when I stopped analyzing him and started observing myself. I noticed that my body felt tense before seeing him, that I prepared emotionally before conversations, as if anticipating evaluation. I noticed that I apologized quickly, even when unsure what I was apologizing for. I noticed how frequently I sought validation from him about decisions that once felt autonomous. The toxicity was not in explosive events. It was in the gradual relocation of my internal authority, and I had participated in it. That realization was not accusatory. It was clarifying. I saw how my desire to preserve connection made me flexible in ways that compromised my core. I saw how his emotional withdrawal activated my attachment patterns, how his intermittent warmth reinforced my hope, how his subtle corrections reshaped my self-perception. None of it looked dramatic from the outside, but internally I was shrinking. The final understanding did not come during a fight. It came during an ordinary afternoon when he questioned my recollection of something trivial, and instead of scrambling to defend myself, I paused. I felt the familiar pull to doubt my memory, to smooth the tension, to concede. But this time, I did not override my perception. I simply said calmly, "That's not how I remember it," and allowed the silence that followed to exist without filling it. In that silence, I felt my internal alignment return. Toxicity thrives where self-trust erodes. The internal twist was not leaving in anger or exposing him publicly. It was recognizing that I no longer felt safe in my own mind within that dynamic. It was understanding that love cannot require constant self-correction. It was accepting that even without visible bruises, a relationship can distort your internal compass. And most importantly, it was admitting that calm voices can still deliver damaging narratives. When I stepped away, the absence of chaos felt almost unfamiliar. There was grief, yes, but there was also a profound quiet that felt different from the silence I had endured before. This quiet did not question me. It did not reinterpret my emotions. It allowed them. And in that space, I began rebuilding the part of myself that had been outsourced. Healing was not instant empowerment. It was gradual recalibration. It was relearning how to make decisions without anticipating correction. It was trusting my memory again. It was expressing discomfort without rehearsing it first. It was forgiving myself for staying longer than I now believe I needed to, and understanding that self-blame is just another form of self-abandonment. The truth about toxic relationships is not always visible in dramatic moments. Sometimes it lives in the subtle shifts of perception, in the quiet ways you begin to distrust your own voice. It lives in the tension between what looks stable and what feels destabilizing. And it often reveals itself only when you choose to believe your internal experience over external appearances. I've shared the journey of learning to recognize what truly matters in love, boundaries, and self-awareness. If you want a gentle guide to understanding your own patterns, gaining clarity, and cultivating meaningful connections, this ebook can support that reflection. You can download the ebook in the description. The link is in the description.